Hello.
Yes.
Hello. Good morning, sir. A very warm welcome from everybody at Gujarat Forensic Sciences University. On behalf of my Director General, Dr. J.M. Vyas, my Director, Dr. Prasenjit Mehti, and our Head of Department of Food Technology Department, Dr. Jairaj Singh Sarvaiya, I, Purti Mohindru, welcome you for today's session on food frauds and other risk chain and other supply chain risks. It's an honor to have you here, sir, and we look forward to learn a lot from your session. And towards the like, everybody is going to ask questions, and by the end of the session, I'll be forwarding these questions to you, and we'll love to hear the explanations from your side. So the floor is yours, sir, and best of luck for your presentation.
Well, hello, everyone. My name is Ron Stakland. I work for Food Chain ID. I'm based in central United States, where it's late in the evening here, but I believe it's nice and early in the morning in India. And I'm truly honored that the Gujarat Forensic Sciences University has invited me to participate in their webinar series. I've been looking forward to this. India is near and dear to my heart. I've been to the country many times. I love India, and it has an amazing history and I think a very, very bright future. So I want to thank all of you for joining us for today's webinar. We're going to be joined in a little while by Dr. Karen Everstein, one of my colleagues here, who is truly one of the leading world experts on the topic of food fraud. And so I'm looking forward to her remarks, and I think you'll enjoy them as well. So I'll give her a more full and proper introduction when it's her turn to speak. But in the meantime, I'll go ahead and begin the presentation with my remarks. Then we'll hear from Karen. And then at the end of the webinar, we're going to leave some time to take questions from you. So if you have questions that you'd like to submit, we'll try to get to as many of them as we can. Let's kick off our presentation now by first defining what we mean by food fraud. Food fraud is the intentional adulteration of food. Now, this word adulteration gets misused a bit in the industry because many people think of it as being synonymous with food fraud, but that's really not the case. If you look at the language of the Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act of 1938, the foundation of all food safety law here in the United States, you'll see that in their view, the word adulteration simply means anything that's not as it should be with respect to the food. And so that means there's either something present that is not supposed to be in the food or something missing that is supposed to be there. And that's pretty wide because there are lots of ways that that can happen. Let's put up a list of substances that would be examples of adulterants in food. So it'd be things like microbes, pesticide residues, allergens, heavy metals, foreign bodies, and so forth. Now, what I hope you notice from this list is that the majority of things that I've just listed actually have nothing to do with fraud. Because remember, fraud means that some person intentionally altered the food for some reason. And incidentally, that reason is usually economically motivated. We call it economically motivated adulteration, or EMA. And this accounts for almost all the food fraud that we deal with in the industry. But things like microbes, pesticides, allergens don't require any individual person to intentionally introduce them because they occur either naturally or they happen accidentally. And we spend a great deal of time as food safety professionals trying to keep these things out of or get them out of our food materials because they can cause so many problems in food recalls. I've developed this image, my image of what a supply chain manager in the food industry must look like, because we've been dealing with food companies, over 30,000 clients in more than 25 years of doing business. And one of the things we've learned is that identifying and managing and preventing these types of issues, these adulterants in the supply chain and in the raw materials, is one of the single biggest challenges that food companies face. Many people don't realize that more than 50% of all food recalls are due to some sort of supply chain contamination or adulteration issue, like the things listed on this page. Now, if we look at this list, we will see that the last two issues shown, mislabeling and substitution, are legitimate examples of food fraud. Somebody's deliberately trying to put one over in the buyer in order to gain an economic advantage. Sometimes foreign bodies can be deliberately introduced, but actually the vast majority of foreign body reports have to do with bits of metal, glass, or plastic that came off of machinery or packaging or something like that. They were not deliberately introduced. I just mentioned substitution or mislabeling as two forms of food fraud. Let's take a deeper look at some of the main ways that fraud is perpetrated on food. First of all, the category of substitution. One typical form is species swapping, and this happens a lot in the seafood industry, where something relatively inexpensive like tilefish might be swapped out and represented as being red snapper. And studies have been done that indicate that in certain markets, it's virtually impossible to actually get authentic red snapper. Even though you see it everywhere in the market, it's something else. Other typical substitution would be mixing low grade or inexpensive oils with olive oil, or swapping out and labeling regular beef as Kobe beef. Kobe beef can sell for several $100s a pound. Or more famously and infamously, a few years ago, we had a major scandal of horse meat showing up in ground beef in Europe. So these are all examples of substitution fraud. Another type of fraud is to add something that doesn't belong there or leave something out that does. A few years ago, there was a major recall here in the United States because it was discovered that somebody had ground up peanuts and peanut shells and mixed it with cumin. And this happened when had been a crop failure of cumin in India. There was a shortage, the prices went very high, and so there was a tremendous economic incentive to add bulk and weight to the cumin because it was selling for such a high price. Unfortunately, somebody added a potentially deadly allergen in the form of peanuts in the process. So it became not just a fraud issue, but a safety issue as well, and triggered a class 1 recall. We've also seen melamine added to milk to increase the protein content, high fructose corn syrup mixed in with honey, or acts of omission, such as we oftentimes see reports of there being less of a vitamin, say vitamin E or something like that, that is on the label of a supplement. Then labeling fraud is another category that is of growing concern. You could have things like free-range chicken that was actually raised in a CAFO but labeled as free-range because of the premium price that it will command. Same thing, a growing evidence that there's more and more fraud going on of labeling conventionally raised foods as organic, again, to take advantage of the premium price. Country of origin fraud is common, and expiration dates. Changing an expiration date so maybe you can get some poor sucker to go ahead and buy the product that you couldn't sell before you have to dispose of it. And then finally, and this is a little more behind the scenes where consumers are concerned, is documentation fraud. And we see this a lot at port interceptions and inspections where there might be an invalid or completely absent health certificate, or it may be that the food was produced in a non-compliant facility, it's come without the benefit of inspection, or there might be a material in it that in the country where it's being imported would be classified as an unapproved new drug. So these are all forms of fraud that are happening all the time in food around the world. One of the goals of today's webinar is to introduce you to some better techniques and tools for identifying and managing supply chain adulterants. One of those tools is Horizon SCAF. Horizon SCAF is a database that gathers incident data about adulteration events in food from all over the world on a daily basis. And in 2019, we added 13,574 new incident reports to Horizon SCAF. And I've created this pie chart that summarizes and breaks them down by adulterant category. As you can see, the single largest category in 2019, as it is every year, was microbes, accounting for nearly a quarter of all the incident reports coming in from around the world. Undeclared allergens was our second largest area, followed by pesticides, mycotoxins, decomposition, foreign bodies, colors, labeling issues, and so forth. Now, we come to fraud, and many people are surprised to see that fraud only accounts for a few percent out of the total number of adulteration reports from around the world. And actually, even this number is a little bit low in my view. In prior years, if we average, say, the last was beers, wines, and spirits, beverage category, followed by processed foods, oils and fats, meats, and honey. There are other areas, such as fruits, that had little or no fraud throughout its history. And you think about it, that makes sense because it's very difficult to imitate a fruit. Plus, there's not much financial incentive for doing it. It's a bulk commodity, and there's not a great deal of extra profit to be made by sneaking in something that's not actually an authentic fruit. Now, this is a historical perspective. Let's take a look at what happened in 2019. So just sort of absorb this chart for a moment, because we're now going to look at a pie chart that shows a breakdown by food category for the year that just ended. And it's actually quite different from what we're looking at right now. So here's the 2019 chart. And what you see immediately here is that rather than spices being near the top with over 20% that it had before, it's now dropped down. It's up there in about the 11 o'clock position of only about 3%, a little over 3% of all the fraud incidents are attributable to spices. The number one category in 2019 was in meat and meat products, followed by seafood, and then we have beverages again. So this is mostly the beer, wine, and spirits, processed foods. Interestingly, oilseeds on the prior chart, the 17-year chart, were down around 1%, but now they're accounting for 8.5% during 2019. So that's a change. And this illustrates the importance of actually having a way to stay current, because you could have a fraud vulnerability plan that was based on historically accurate information, but that information may have nothing to do with the current supply chain. Part of the value that you're going to see demonstrated in Horizon Scan in a moment is that you can literally see what's happening right now with respect to your food commodities, and you can adjust your food safety plan to respond to what's actually threatening your supply chain now, as opposed to information that might be out of date by now. Let's go inside the actual Horizon Scan database and take a little journey together. Horizon Scan is a database that aggregates food safety and quality reports from all over the world. It was developed and is operated by FRAUDS Sciences, with whom our company, Food Chain ID, has partnered to bring Horizon Scan out to the food industry all around the world. One of the tabs that we see on the homepage is called Recently Added Issues, and if we click on this, we will see some of these reports, everything that's been added to the database just in the last 2 business days at the time I took these screenshots. And we can see that we have different commodities being reported on. Here we have some sort of breadcrumb product. Here's a sweet corn and baby corn product, biscuits and pastries from India, fresh fish from Guyana, and so forth. In every case, we see that this country of origin where the product came from, and we also see the name of the country that inspected this particular commodity and issued a report when they found some sort of problem. So, for example, this first entry was domestically inspected. It stayed within Australia, and the problem they found in these breadcrumbs was undeclared gluten. If we go down and look at our product from India, pastries, biscuits, and cakes, it was sent to Israel. It was examined, and these Murano chocolate chips had a problem because they had undeclared milk, which, of course, for some people is a very dangerous allergen. And if we go down this list, we'll see report after report that has come into the database just over the last couple of days. So it's a very extensive database. It draws reports from about 120 sources all over the world. Most of these are official governmental inspection agencies, like in the United States, we have the FDA and the USDA. In Canada, the Canadian Food Inspection Agency, the Japan Ministry of Health. All of these countries have official agencies whose data is pulled into Horizon Scan and updated twice a day. Now, if we look down this list and we want to sort it by a particular country of origin, we can click on the column header, and let's go down and see what new reports we've brought into the database in the last couple of days regarding India. And so we see 3 reports here. Sorry, highlighting the wrong things. Here's one. This is the pastries we looked at. We also have some peanuts from India that were sent to the Netherlands, and the Dutch inspectors found aflatoxins. And here we have sesame seed that was sent also to the Netherlands, and in this case, they found salmonella contamination, salmonella being a microbial contaminant. So these are examples of the types of reports that are being added to the database every day. Now, the database contains about 15 to 20 years worth of historical data, reports just like these, and we can actually use this system to go back and do historical research and look at general trends in different commodities. We just looked at sesame, so let's just follow that one through the database. I'm going to do a search on sesame seed, which also includes tahini and halva, because of course these are products made from sesame seeds. So let's do a search and see what we can learn. The first place that we're taken to is a summary page that summarizes at a high level this 15 to 20 years worth of hazard reports and data on sesame seeds. On the left bar graph, we see the 5 countries of origin that have the most incident reports in the database. India being number 1, Sudan number 2, followed by Nigeria, Turkey, and Uganda. All of the rest of the countries in the world that are exporting sesame seeds and have had a problem are lumped into this 6th bar called All Others. On the right, we have the most common hazards being reported. And so here at a glance, we can see that in most cases, salmonella is the primary problem that is detected in sesame seeds. We also have FDA import refusals. That could mean many different things. It means they did not actually test it, but they had some other suspicion or reason for rejecting it. And then we see pesticide residues, aflatoxins, fraudulent documentation, and so forth. For any of these bars, if we'd like to look more closely at the information behind them, so for example, if we want to glance at these 353 incidents from India, we just click right on the bar and it opens up a table, just like the kind you've already seen, and we can go through and we see in most cases it's salmonella. In some cases, it's an unauthorized color or some sort of fraudulent documentation. But we can see at a glance here that salmonella seems to be the dominant problem of sesame seeds shipped from India. On the left, we have a toolbox of pre-designed search filters that help us as quality control and food safety professionals immediately see certain conclusions and results from all the data that we have. As you can see here, we probably have 12 or 1,300, maybe 1,500 reports on sesame. But for example, if you wanted to look specifically at fraud issues, and now we all know that fraud means intentional adulteration, you could go to this tool on the left and click the fraud button, and it will select and only display those incidents in the past for sesame seeds that involve intentional adulteration. Perhaps it was document fraud. Looks like that's the main case here. But sometimes you see things like substitution and other issues of intentional deception being involved. Also on the left, we have a supplier check because most of the reports that come into Horizon Scan include the name of the suppliers who had a problem. And we can look at those names. Let's click on this bar. And let's pick a country of origin. We've already picked on India a little bit. So let's switch and let's look at Turkey. So I'm asking the database to show me the names of suppliers of sesame seeds in Turkey who have a problem report in the database. And when we do that search, we find we have 40 of them, and here are their names. Listed here, along with the problem that was found and when it was detected. So this is very recent, just a few weeks ago in March of 2020, there was salmonella detected in some halva that was shipped from Turkey. So we have a very rapid way to do research on potential suppliers to find out historical sort of patterns that we might be concerned with if we're procuring different commodities from different suppliers or from different countries of origin. And finally, we have a risk assessment tool that helps us prioritize of all the risks that are presented in sesame seeds, what are the ones that we need to be most concerned with right now? And we could look at this in several different ways. We could look at pesticides as a group, mycotoxins, which are fungal contaminants, veterinary drugs. We won't find those in sesame seeds, but we would find a lot of them in things like shrimp and other crustaceans, poultry, pork, different kinds of meat products. We do have allergens, we have microbial issues, and we have fraud. Let's look at the allergens. So I'm going to click that button, and what you'll see is that with respect to each combination of a unique country of origin and a particular type of allergen, we do a data analysis that assigns a prioritization of high, medium, low, or very low. And this is our assessment of what your priority should be for the issues that you need to be controlling for and looking out for in your supply chain. The basis of this is a time or recency algorithm. The logic is that if you're talking about something that was reported quite recently, then it stands to reason that it may still be a problem in the supply chain right now, and you need to be vigilant and paying attention. On the other hand, if you have to go back farther in time to find the last time that this particular issue occurred, we think that means there's lower probability that it's in the supply chain right now. And once you reach 3 years or more, it's the opinion of the scientists at FARA that there is very low risk that it's still in the supply chain right now. So what we're saying here, for example, is that if you were to source sesame seeds from Lebanon, then your risk of undeclared peanuts is very low. On the other hand, if you go up here and you source sesame seeds from Egypt, risk of undeclared peanuts is medium, which we now know means that it has been reported not in the last 1 year, but in the last 2 years. So there's some lingering suspicion that that could be in the supply chain right now. So all of these tools that are built into Horizon Scan not only provide you with a great deal of up-to-date information, daily reports on what's happening in the global supply chain, but it gives you a way of looking at the history and identifying trends, different types of frauds that have occurred, different types of non-fraud adulteration. You can search by country of origin, you can search by commodity, you can search by hazard, you can search by supplier. It gives you a huge amount of flexibility in terms of understanding the big picture of what types of risks there are in over 600 different food commodities sourced from all the countries of the world. As you've just seen, Horizon Scan contains a tremendous amount of data about what sort of issues are being reported in different food materials from different countries all over the world. And I thought it might be interesting to just step away for a moment from our focus on fraud today and show you the big picture of what types of problems are being reported in food products from India. So this chart represents the last 5 years worth of Horizon Scan reports with respect to India as the country of origin for these food materials. And these are the types of issues being found. Microbes is number one, and then mislabeling and misbranding issues account for over 16% of the import refusals, rejections, and other problems that importing countries have issued with respect to Indian food. Then we have pesticide residues, decomposition, unauthorized or illegal colors, mycotoxins, which are fungal contaminants, and we come to fraud, which was the topic of today's conversation. We can see it's a relatively small percentage of all the issues being reported, about 4.3%. That means everything else on this chart is not thought to have been deliberately introduced, but is something that occurred either naturally or accidentally. We can take the same data set, so I'm going to move to the next pie chart. So again, this is all the incidents of food originating in India for the last 5 years, but now we're looking at it by commodity type or food type. And the largest category is the spice category. 21.7% of all the reports, negative reports or import refusals and so forth with regard to Indian food, were attributable to spices. Processed foods were the second largest category, followed by unprocessed cereals. Now this is mostly rice. Probably more than 95% of this has to do with rice. Processed cereals, 9.6%. These are things such as biscuits, cookies, bread, pasta, flour, different products that are made and exported from cereals. Then we come to seafood, oil seeds. So this again, the sesame seeds we talked about would be an example of an oil seed. Peanuts are also a very large component of this category. And then we have fresh herbs, fruiting vegetables, and a number of other issues that account for smaller and smaller percentages of all the issues attributable to Indian food around the world. At this point, I'm going to turn the podium over to my co-presenter, Dr. Karen Everstein. Karen works with Discernus, which is a company that we used to compete with, but we had such admiration for them that last year we joined forces. And Discernus is now a part of the Food Chain ID group of companies, and Dr. Everstein is now one of my esteemed colleagues. And it's a pleasure and an honor to work with Karen on a daily basis. Karen has worked in food protection for more than 15 years, primarily supporting the food industry in ensuring food authenticity and compliance with regulatory and GFSI food fraud requirements. In fact, she leads the food fraud initiatives here at Food Chain ID, including management of the food fraud database, which is a resource that she's going to be demonstrating as part of her remarks. It standardizes relevant data that supports fraud vulnerability assessments. Karen previously held both research-based and applied roles in academia, government, and nonprofit organizations, and she's collaborated with members of the food industry and regulatory agencies on many projects. She received her PhD from the School of Public Health at the University of Minnesota, my alma mater, and began her food safety career as a foodborne disease epidemiologist at the Minnesota Department of Health. So I'm looking forward to hearing her remarks, as I'm sure you are. So please help me welcome Dr. Karen Everstein.
Thank you, Ron. I appreciate your kind introduction. I wanted to start out with a little bit of information about Discernus. Discernus was founded in 2003 and we're headquartered in the US with operations across Europe and representatives in the Asia Pacific. And of course, now we are under the umbrella of Food Chain ID, which is very exciting. Our flagship tools are gComply and gComply Plus, and these provide access to over 100,000 regulations for food and consumer products, cosmetics, and contaminants, and they allow compliance analysis and recipe management to support product development. And we have a unique approach to finding what we call regulatory truth. So we have high-level partnerships with government agencies, subject matter experts on staff, and we have a global research team that monitors and interprets regulatory developments around the world. In 2018, Discernus took over operation of the food fraud database, which was originally developed at USP, and that's what we're going to focus on today. So let's talk about a few recent examples of food fraud that I think nicely illustrate the range of types of fraud that can happen globally. Last year, it was reported that Europol had dismantled a criminal network that was selling fraudulent olive oil in the EU. And the oil actually consisted of lower quality oils that were adulterated with chlorophyll, beta-carotene, and soybean oil. This product was sold into the German market, reportedly targeting restaurant owners, and ultimately 150,000 liters of adulterated oil were seized and about 20 people were arrested. And I think that this illustrates the pervasiveness of the problem even in parts of the world, such as the EU, which have significantly increased their food fraud prevention efforts over the past 10 years. Here in the US, the FDA reported an incident where a man in Ohio admitted to buying injured, sick, and potentially medicated cows at a discounted price and then selling those to slaughter facilities for human food. This incident was uncovered when, upon random inspection, one of the carcasses was found to be contaminated with gentamicin, which is not approved for use in cattle. This then led to questioning by the FDA Office of Criminal Investigations and the ultimate discovery of the scheme to maximize profit through the sale of injured and sick cattle. And finally, this was from 2018, but I like to mention it because of the focus in recent years on some of these value-added label attributes such as organic. Corn and soybeans that were grown in Nebraska that were not organic, they were so-called conventional corn and soy, were marketed as certified organic, thereby yielding higher prices. And this apparently happened over a 7-year period. Some of the farmers were apparently aware of the misrepresentation of their crops by the man who was marketing them, and they ultimately pleaded guilty to wire fraud charges, which is notable since violations of organic standards have usually been handled through regulatory action instead of criminal prosecution. Now let's talk a little bit about some recent developments in the area of food fraud generally. The first one I wanted to mention is the International Association of Food Protection Professional Development Group, or the IAFP Food Fraud PDG. This was formed a couple of years ago. We had an in-person meeting at the annual IAFP meeting last summer, and there'll be another one this year for any of you who may be interested. So it's currently scheduled on Sunday, August 2nd at 3:15 p.m. in Cleveland. So it's the day before IAFP officially starts. Last year, we held a webinar series focused on food fraud, and we're currently planning other potential activities for 2020. So I would certainly encourage you to get involved if you might be interested. There will be a link at the end of this presentation to the appropriate webpage for you to sign up. The second thing I wanted to mention is the Codex Alimentarius Committee on Food Import and Export Inspection and Certification Systems, otherwise known as CCFIX, because they have taken up the issue of food authenticity and food fraud prevention. So there's a U.S. delegation to Codex that has been soliciting comments on a draft discussion paper that was prepared by the chair and co-chairs. So this is the United States, China, the EU, and the Republic of Iran. So they've been preparing this paper ahead of the next scheduled in-person meeting of the committee, which is later this year in Tasmania. So I also put in a link to the Codex CCFIX page and a link to sign up for the U.S. Codex program updates at the end of this presentation. So now for the other codex, the Food Chemicals Codex. So this group at USP has been working on new standards for olive oil and honey. Now these are particularly challenging standards to develop, and the expert panels working on them have involved many stakeholders from industry, regulatory agencies, and academics. So there's a standard, an identity standard for refined olive oil, which was published in the Food Chemicals Codex in September of 2019, and draft identity standards for both extra virgin olive oil and for honey are expected later this year. Gina Clapper from USP will be presenting during a food fraud session at IAFP this summer to talk about that process for developing these standards and some of the challenges that they have encountered. And finally, I wanted to mention some current work that's being undertaken by AOAC. They started a food authenticity and fraud program and created 2 working groups to improve surveillance options for food fraud, a targeted testing working group and a non-targeted testing working group. These groups are currently developing what they call standard method performance requirements, or SMPRs. And one of the goals is to support the development of standards that will lead to Codex Type 2 methods for dispute resolution in international trade. So I just wanted to make a quick note about what a non-targeted method is. So AOAC is doing some work in this area of non-targeted methods, and also the USP Food Chemicals Codex group has published this guidance on the development and validation of non-targeted methods for adulteration detection. So I just wanted to say a quick couple words about this. So what is a non-targeted method, since this is such a big area of development in food fraud? And basically it is an analytical measurement or a test that is sensitive to multiple potential adulterants. So basically you can take a material, and what you're doing is trying to identify whether that material fits within the range of what is known for authentic materials. You're not necessarily wedded to this idea of testing for specific adulterants. And one of the reasons that this can work so well for food fraud detection, and certainly for screening for food fraud, is that food fraud related adulterants are usually present in higher concentrations. And so you don't need to detect down to these really minuscule levels. If you're adding something to have an economic benefit in a product, it will be usually present at slightly higher levels. So again, you can download this guidance from the USP website if you're interested to read more about that. The first thing you see when you log into the database is the dashboard screen. This shows you what is new in the database overall at the top of the screen, and then what is new in your ingredients of interest at the bottom half of the screen. So you'll see in the top half of the screen, you can see the number of records that's been added over the past week, month, and quarter. We tend to list here the new ingredients that have been added. And this bottom half of the screen is tailored to my particular user profile. So you can see that I've built some of these groups over here. So There's a frozen pizza group. So these are all the ingredients that might be found in a frozen pizza or a muffin or a coffee drink, for example. And so that's one of the big features of the food fraud database is that you can build and maintain your own ingredient groups and then track those throughout the system. So I will switch here to the management tab. And you'll see here that we have a bunch of system ingredient groups that were built. So these are basically like commodity groups or groups of ingredients with similar functional properties. And if you click on one of them, that you can see all of the ingredients that are in that group. And these are usable by any user. They can be viewed by everybody in the system, and then you can search by them or create a graph using them. And they're, again, viewable by all of our FFD users. Whereas user ingredient groups are specific to a user profile. And so a particular user that builds one of these groups is the only person that can see that group. So these are ones that I have built. Again, I mentioned the frozen pizza group. If we click on that, you can see all of the ingredients in this group. And I've built quite a few others for demonstration purposes. So now if we go to the search records module, I can search by a single ingredient. For example, if I search by tomato, this is simultaneously searching any ingredient that has the word tomato in it or any adulterant that has the word tomato in it. And then I could continue to filter if I needed to. But I can also search by that ingredient group. So that frozen pizza demo. Now what I'm doing is I'm simultaneously searching all of the records that were in that group. And I can see the most recent records at the top. If I pop this one out, you can see all of the details that we capture. So this is an inference record. And so this comes from this published report on a detection method for detecting pork and ground beef. If I click on this, I can go to the original record. And so we always link to our original citation. Obviously, we cannot provide access to copyright protected content, but if you have that through your organization, then you would have access to that here. So inference records are capturing information about probable increased risk of fraud based on something that's not an actual occurrence of fraud. Whereas an incident record is an actual occurrence of fraud with contextual information about where it occurred, when it occurred, and other details like that. And so in this case, this was also looking at meat adulteration, but this was an actual reported incident of fraud. And so again, you can click on the reference and see the primary source information. In this case, it is in French, so we can ask Google to translate that for us. But that's basically how that works. So incident and inference records are the two main record types that people use. Obviously, we have users that only want to focus on what is known to have occurred, whereas inference records basically give you a wider net of what might be possible or what kind of elevated risk might be out there. We also have a handful of automated data analytics that are built. I won't go through all of them. I'll just show you the ingredient comparison. So again, if you were going to implement a search based on that frozen pizza group of ingredients, what this does is it gives you a snapshot of what is in the database. And so it gives you an idea of what might be potentially higher risk, both because it has a higher number of records in the database. You can see that there on the x-axis, and because it has a high number of distinct adulterants on the y-axis. So olive oil, for example, is associated with 66 records in the database and 39 distinct adulterants. And so this kind of just gives you a quick snapshot of those ingredients that might be considered higher vulnerability, again, based on the information that's in the database, which comes from that variety of sources and is always technically publicly available data. So we put out a food fraud newsletter about once a month, and I'm showing you a snapshot here of our December newsletter because it gives a little summary of some of our work in 2019. So you can see that we added about 1,300 new records and 168 new ingredients. And the top ingredients that were associated with incidents in 2019 included beef, ghee, liquor, milk, spices, and wines. And the top ingredients associated with inference records included honey, extra virgin olive oil, fish of various species, butter, milk, and rice. Now, these are single ingredients, and we often find it helpful to look at things by commodity group, just because often single ingredients are so specific that the numbers for each can be relatively small. But this is what we saw in 2019. And the last thing I wanted to mention was a quick look at some of these other trends that we talked about earlier. So this idea of label attributes for things like organic, protected designation of origin, so-called locally sourced. So there was not a lot of representation of this type of fraud in that 10-year period from 2000 through 2009. But you can see in this most recent 10-year period that has increased substantially, partially again due to the fact that marketing for these types of attributes has increased a lot. And so when you have a trendy area like this, you're probably going to see the results in fraud. But I just wanted to show you this in terms of one of the trends that we've seen over the past 10 years or so. Okay, thank you all so much for joining this webinar. I appreciate your attention. As I mentioned, here is a list of references, both to some of the incidents that I talked about, as well as some of those resources we talked about in terms of recent food fraud developments. And now I will hand it back to Ron.
Well, thank you, Karen. As always, that was excellent. I always learn something new whenever I hear Dr. Eberstein speak, and I hope you enjoyed it. We certainly appreciate, Karen, that you were able to take the time to contribute to today's webinar. So in a moment, we're going to go to questions and answers from our audience, or questions from the audience, and I will try to provide the answers. Before we do that, I just want to sum up a little bit about our company and some of the things that you've seen demonstrated today. You were able to see Horizon Scan in action today, as well as a short demonstration of the food fraud database. These are both tools that can assist you in identifying potential intentional adulteration issues in your ingredients and in your products. And in the case of Horizon Scan, you can go outside the realm of food fraud and also look at almost every type of ingredient level risk, hazard, adulterant, whatever you want to call it, as well as do research on global suppliers of over 600 types of food commodities. Our company has an office in India, and I want to introduce you now to our managing director, at least provide you with her contact information, Chinmayi Dalgaonkar, and I may have gotten the pronunciation wrong, and if so, I apologize for that. And through our office in India, we, in addition to offering Horizon Scan and food fraud database to the food industry and to academia, we offer a full range of certification services for food safety, for organic, for non-GMO certification and verification. We have testing laboratories around the world, and we're actively growing our testing business in India. We're an ISO 17025 accredited laboratory, all types of food safety and authenticity issues that we can help you with. And then finally, if you're a food company and you're in the business of exporting food products around the world, then you should be very interested in G-Comply and G-Comply Plus. These are database services that we offer that are the most comprehensive library in the world of global food regulatory and labeling requirements for virtually every type of food in almost every country of the world. We have coverage in 219 countries. So you can see exactly what the rules and regulations are for any country in which you wish to export products, so that you can make sure in advance that they fully comply with the local laws and local regulations. And with that, I'm going to open the floor to questions. I will leave our Indian office contact information on the screen so that you can copy that down if you do have questions or would like to learn more about Horizon Scan or the food fraud database, or any of the other excellent services that we can offer your food company to assist you in creating safer, more authentic food. So let's go ahead and invite our sponsors to forward any questions to me that you'd like me to respond to. And thank you very, very much for all of you for your time.
Hello.
Yes, Purti.
Yes, sir. So I have some interesting questions for you. And it was a very informative session, and I've learned so much. And this is the first time I think I'm perceiving food frauds from a very different point of view. And the way Dr. Karen explained and the way you explained, I think the role of statistics has come into dealing with food fraud is something very different and something very new for us. So thank you for that.
Yes.
Okay, I'll go ahead with the questions. Are economically motivated frauds addressed in any FSME's food safety plans, sir?
Yes, actually, all of the main global food safety standards, the GFSI standards, GFSI means the Global Food Safety Initiative, and it's a set of standards that were developed by a very large number of countries and stakeholders that laid out best practices for producing safe and authentic food. And examples of these standards that are based on the GFSI guidance are FSSC 22000 or SQF, Safe Quality Food, or BRC, which stands for the British Retail Consortium. All of these are GFSI standards, and all of the GFSI standards now contain a requirement that you do a fraud vulnerability assessment. So always they've had an emphasis on, keeping the food safe, but there's a recognition that it needs to be more than just about safety, because there's a tremendous negative economic impact of food fraud. And it was agreed that we needed to, as an industry, to address that more scrupulously than had been in the past. So now, when you're a food manufacturer, for example, and you want to get a certification to the GFSI standard, you have to demonstrate to the auditor that you have done a meaningful fraud vulnerability analysis and assessment, and that you have considered fraud as a potential vulnerability in your business. And so for that reason, a lot of companies now subscribe to the food fraud database and to Horizon Scan, because they need a tool that gives them some visibility into the intentional adulteration.
Okay, so one of the participants had gone through the website and they came across a word called Proform. So can you elaborate this term for us?
Proform?
Yeah.
Well, that's a different service that we offer. It's actually not my area of specialization. I wish that I had the person on the line right now at our company who handles that area. Our company is involved in a very wide portfolio of sustainability standards with many different possible parameters that could be involved in those standards. We have a service called ProTerra that looks at all kinds of issues like environmental protection. It looks at genetic modified organization. It looks at responsible pesticide usage. And my understanding is that the Proform is similar to that, but it's specifically a standard aimed at farms rather than manufacturing facilities and other parts of the supply chain. It's really more at the supply origin level of food safety practices and sustainability practices.
Okay. So what are the resources available for companies to fight food frauds?
Well, I think first step in combating something like food fraud is you have to have some way to identify which types of food are being subjected to fraud. Because once you know that, then you can do certain authenticity testing. You can, you can address the issue with your suppliers. And this again, really, we think our company has found the two best tools in the world right now for identifying those fraud vulnerabilities between Horizon Scan, which kind of covers everything, including fraud, and then the food fraud database that Karen demonstrated very specifically goes very deeply, sort of goes vertically deep into the whole issue of food fraud, and even provides some resources of, here are techniques and testing methodologies for detecting potential fraud and for mitigating them and addressing them. So I would say the first step is to get access to these tools that let you know what type of fraud is currently being detected and reported around the world. And then you can take steps to, maybe require your suppliers to provide certain certificates where they go on record as saying, we are testing to make sure that there are no foreign fraudulently introduced materials in my supply chain or in my products, things like this.
Okay. So talking about the two databases that you have presented, one Horizon Scan database that you presented, and Dr. Karen also presented a database. How to access these database, and are these database bases for free, or do we need some way to access them?
You need to pay for them. They're a subscription service. They're both sold as an annual subscription, and
Okay.
the cost will vary depending on how many people in your company that you want to have access, want to have licenses and so forth. And we have the phone number and email on the screen right now of our India office, and they can provide you with the India pricing. The food fraud database is fairly inexpensive. Horizon Scan is more expensive because it covers a much, much broader range of types of hazards and adulterants and so forth. But yes, you can get information from our India office about the cost. And then, we have a cost for industry, and then we have a lower price for academia and universities and so forth.
Okay. Okay. So what are the scopes? Like, what is the scope of Horizon Scan? Can you highlight the scopes? The same.
Yes. Well, Horizon Scan covers about 600 different food commodities, the most commonly traded commodities in the world. It covers about 180 countries of origin that those foods come from. And then the data in Horizon Scan mostly comes from official government inspection agencies. So like the FDA here in the United States or the FSA in the UK, all of the EU country inspection agencies contribute to Horizon Scan. So does India, so does China, Russia, Hong Kong. About 120 agencies around the world have given permission for us to pull their information in every day and update that into the database. And so that's sort of the scope of it. It's very global in its coverage. It covers not only raw ingredients, but it also covers processed ingredients, even finished products. So we can look and we could see wheat, we could also see flour, or we could see cookies and biscuits made from the flour, things like, all those types of products. So at all levels of the supply chain, as long as it's something that's being inspected by government inspection agencies, then we try to put all those reports into the database.
Okay, so it's a very specific question that some participant has asked, that how many rice varieties does the database have, and does it also identify basmati rice from India?
That's a good question. And yes, it has a very broad category of rice, but you can also do very specific word search based searches where you could specify, I want to see basmati rice, or I want to see jasmine rice, or I want to see, rice flour, things like that. So there is some information that's a little bit more granular, like you're describing.
Okay, sir. And somebody has asked that whether they can access this database as an individual and not as an on an academic platform or industrial platform.
Well, yeah, I think as long as somebody is willing to pay for the subscription, we're willing to have them as a customer.
Okay, that's great. Okay, so probably the last question: are there any laws that work in the favor of a consumer if a food fraud is detected?
Well, it's an interesting thing about the laws because food fraud, sometimes food fraud creates a safety issue. So, for example, I showed the example before where some cumin had ground up peanuts mixed with it. And some people are very allergic to peanuts. So this became a safety issue. And so the inspection agencies around the world, for example, here in the United States, the Food and Drug Administration got very involved in that particular case because there was a safety issue. And all the laws, at least in the United States right now, the focus is on safety. Now, what's interesting is there are a lot of types of fraud in food that happen, and they cost a lot of money, but they don't present a safety risk. And therefore, the governments basically in many cases, ignore them. And I'll give you a good example. Olive oil has different grades. The most expensive and finest quality olive oil is called extra virgin olive oil. And a study was done by the University of California at Davis to look at imported olive oil from Europe. And what they learned was that when they tested it, they found that something like 69% of all the extra virgin olive oil being imported from Europe into the United States was not actually extra virgin. It was a lower grade olive oil. But if you look in Horizon Scan and look for reports by the FDA about this problem, you find almost nothing because the FDA does not pay attention. And the reason is that if you or I buy olive oil that is actually an inferior grade, we're still not going to get sick. We're not going to die. And therefore, the FDA, they know this is going on. They know it's costing a lot of money to the industry. But from their point of view, they have limited resources and they've decided we can't do everything. So our priority has to be safety and keeping people from getting sick, keeping people alive. And they don't have the resources to go after all these fraud events that do not create a safety issue, even though they might have huge financial repercussions for the industry. So the laws, unfortunately, are very much focused on safety, just to answer your question. And fraud, that's why why industry really has to be the one, I think, to manage fraud, because we're not getting very much help from the governments when it comes to fraud. They don't have the resources to do it.
Okay, so I want to thank you for elaborating and answering every question with such a good. We could understand every point of it, and I'm sure the participants must have also benefited a lot from the question answer session. And again, I would like to thank you for introducing us food technologists to this sort of a database, because it's a very new thing for us, and I think. As a student and as a research scholar, I'm also very intrigued to learn a lot more about this database. So thank you for creating it, and thank you for sharing it with us. And I on behalf of my director, my director general, and my HOD, I would like to thank you for conducting this session and throwing light on such an important issue.
Well, you're very welcome, and it was totally my pleasure. And it's been too many years since I've been into India. I've missed it, and I look forward to being able to visit again once we can travel again. And also, I'm certainly very happy to have made this connection with your university, and would be very happy to do it all again someday soon.
So we would love to host you, and if you're in India, then I think we'd love to have you at GFSU, and we'd love to make a apart from just from webinars, I think we would love to have a live session, a one-to-one human-to-human interactive session with you.
Oh, very good. That's a date. I would love it. I would like that too. So thank you so much, and everyone have a good day. And I'm going to go and go to sleep.
Yes, sir. Thank you so much, and take care, sir. And hope to see you soon in India.
Okay. Bye-bye.